I know you already gave a.
Okay, there you go. Now somebody just recorded it. So now it's recording.
All right. Okay. D-Man. Okay.
D-Man.
So what are the teams again? Who's Spaz, you, and I?
Yes.
Right?
And then it's Luis, Steve / Amir, and Rob. And everyone else is basically here to observe. I'm open to them also talking in the free form, but I guess maybe to keep it a little under control, it'd be better if only the 6 of us. I mean, what do you guys think?
I think that it'd be better to let the 6 of us do the talking, and then everyone else, if they want to say their piece, they could like text chat or something.
Okay. Everyone agrees with that?
Rob said he's not participating.
Okay, that's fine. Okay. So let's.
Basically, I'm sorry. I know you said you gave an introduction and all. What's the premise now that we're really focusing on? Just so we can stick with the topic, if you don't mind. Okay. I'm sorry. I apologize for asking you the same question again.
Yeah. So the premise is basically I'm arguing that Herem is the way it was practiced is amounting to human sacrifice. Luis and his team are going to argue that it is not. That it is not.
By the way, I know I think we mentioned that I would go first, but isn't it customary in these sorts of debates for the affirmative to speak first?
Sure, I can go. That's fine. All right, so 20 minutes, right?
Yes.
Let me just share my screen.
Let you time yourself.
Yes, that's fine. So can you guys all see my screen?
You'll see it.
Okay. So this is basically a run. This is basically all I had in my last video, all the screenshots. Let me just share. Also, sorry, 1 second. Okay. All right, so basically the major verses that I'm going to focus on are verses from the book of Joshua, from Deuteronomy, from Numbers, and then some other scattered verses from books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, so on and so forth. So the point that I had made in my videos is, as I said before, that Herem, which literally means to prescribe or to devote something to Yahweh, to the service of Yahweh. It can also mean as a ban. So something is banned. So in other words, for example, when a city was banned, right, Yahweh was basically making that city inhabitable. You cannot take that city and settle in it. You cannot make farmland on it. You cannot do anything with it. So hence, that's what it meant, the ban. Now, the Jewish Study Bible says that this law of the ban is an anachronistic literary formulation. It arose not during the time, so in other words, it wasn't really practiced the way it is said in the Bible. It arose in 6th century Judea. It existed before that, but in the Bible, at least, when it is mentioned in books like Deuteronomy or Joshua or whatever, it's reflecting later times in the history of Israel. All right, and I cited several sources. For example, not just the Jewish Study Bible, but also a Catholic Introduction to the Bible by John Bergsma and Brian Petrie, who explained that in a military context, when you were defeating an enemy, you were dedicating that city and everyone in it to the deity. And they specifically call it a sacrifice or an offering to God. And notice how it said also the analogy of a burnt offering. What is a burnt offering? Basically, it's a sacrifice. And they cite Joshua 6:17 through 19. And let me just again reiterate, this is all stuff that I've already mentioned in my video. So if you've already watched the video, this is going to be basically mostly repetition. And I also cited Moshe Benowitz, who is a scholar of the Talmud and rabbinics, in his book called Nidri. He also calls it an offering to God. So when you're offering human beings in a city, you're destroying them, they are the offering to God. A key verse that I had mentioned in the previous videos was Leviticus 27, 28 through 29. So if you can read, this is Moshe Benowitz's rendering. But no herem, be it man or livestock, or land of a man's holding, in other words, property, nothing that a man has made herem may be sold or redeemed. So once you've made that vow, you're offering this person or an animal or property to God, it cannot be undone. And then every herem is totally consecrated to the Lord. And then verse 29 says, no human being who is made herem can be ransomed. He shall be put to death. So many scholars like Benowitz, Bergsma, Petrie, I believe they mentioned it too, Susan Nidich, Tom Stark, who's a Christian, they argue that these verses this is talking about sacrificing a person, a human. Now, Benowitz argues that Leviticus 28, if you see where the 2 arrows are, this section, he argues, was added later as basically like an explanatory type of verse. So he says that Leviticus 27:28 consists of 2 sentences, each of which begins with the same Hebrew words. Our Hebrew scholars here can read those 2 words. And they state the same idea. So he argues that there are doublets, and one of them was added later in the history of the text, the transmission of the text. Right, and notice here how he explains this verse. Right, Leviticus 27:29 creates an ethical crux. The implication is that a man can devote his slave as herem, whereupon the slave is immolated, right? In other words, burned as an offering to God. And Rob had made the point in his response to me originally in his thread that I didn't consider, guys like Rashi and, but Moshe Benowitz, the Jewish Study Bible, all these scholarly sources considered the commentators, and they basically said that they're ignoring the context. So to appeal to Rashi, yes, it represents the later dominant position. This is what Susan Nidis calls the dominant voice in the Bible, the dominant position, that human sacrifice is an abomination, it is to be rejected, it is not something that God asked for. And there are verses in the Bible that say this. Deuteronomy 12:31, for example, clearly speaks against child sacrifice and human sacrifice. But this is a later voice, that became the dominant voice that rejected human sacrifices. And there's a lot of scholarly discussion on this. I'm currently reading Susan Nidich's book, War in the Hebrew Bible. She talks about this at length. All right, now there's also a contradiction that, at least according to Benowitz, that arises. So if you read Leviticus 27:21, it says that Herem land is the personal possession of the priest. Right? One of the things that Rob had made up the point of was that the reason for the Herem was to get rid of a contagion. All right, so the pagan nations, because they could have possibly enticed the Israelites to worship other gods and become pagans themselves, they needed to be removed for that reason. And therefore, all the people, even the land itself, was banned. You could not live on the land. But Moshe Benowitz notes the contradiction. If Leviticus 27:21 is saying that a land can be given to the priest, but it's off limit to everyone else, his wife and his daughters, and to all farmhands who are not ritually pure, and also anything that is grown on the land cannot be marketable because it is herem. It is not allowed to be sold. So that kind of creates a contradiction between this verse and other verses. And then I also made the association with Judges 11. This is the clearest example of someone in the Bible performing human sacrifice. So the story goes that the warrior Jephthah was chosen to lead the Israelites during the age of the Judges in a war against the Ammonites. And verse 29 says that the Spirit of the Lord was on Jephthah. And one of the things I noticed among the commentaries, like the ESV commentaries, they always seem to ignore the fact that the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. And then what happens after that? He passes through the lands, and then verse 30, he makes a vow he made a vow to the Lord and said, if you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever, it can also mean whoever, right? This Hebrew word here that has been translated whatever in the ESV can also mean whoever, comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. So he's basically making the vow that if it's a person or an animal, whatever, it will be sacrificed if Yahweh gives me the Ammonites. All right. So the argument I made was this was done when Jephthah had the Spirit of the Lord on him. He was under divine inspiration. The commentaries seem to ignore this point, which is something I found strange. So what happens after 2 months? All right. So obviously Jephthah defeats the Ammonites. And when he heads home, the first person to meet him is his daughter. So obviously he's distraught. He's grieving that he's forced to sacrifice his daughter. And what happens is she agrees to the arrangement, but she asks for a 2-month waiting period so she can mourn and so on and so forth. And then after 2 months, it says that he did with her according to his vow that he made. Now here also, some of the commentaries try to suggest that, well, it's possible that he didn't kill her. He didn't sacrifice her. But that's basically what it says. I mean, his vow was he will offer it as a burnt offering. And then verse 39 says he did according to his vow that he made. So in other words, she was sacrificed. Now, Moshe Benovich notes that there is absolutely no condemnation of this practice. Nothing is said. Yahweh doesn't say this is an abomination. He doesn't intervene. Nothing is said that would suggest that this was an abomination and should not have been done. Yeah, and we'll come back to this point as well later on during the free-flowing talk. So here's the ESV Study Bible. You can see here it talks about how the Spirit of the Lord comes on Jephthah. It quotes it directly, and then just that's it. And then he moves on to the vow, and he calls it a foolish vow, which makes no sense to me because, again, the Spirit of the Lord is on him, so how can it be a foolish vow? He's literally making the vow under divine inspiration. Here's Tom Stark's book. This is also a good book to read. He makes a point of comparing the Mesha stele to Numbers 21. So the Mesha stele is from the 9th century BCE. It was an inscription made by the Moabite king Mesha, who said that his god Chemosh had told him to take the city of Nebo from Israel. And then what does he do? He fights them, he defeats them, and then slays all the people. He says 7,000 men, women, and boys. Whether it was 7,000 or not, that could be a hyperbole. It could be an exaggeration. But what he's saying is he did kill everyone that he was found in the city, however many the people that was. And then notice how it says, for I had devoted them to destruction. So the word is Herem, for the god Ashtar Chemosh. So I would ask our Christian friends, do you think that this amounts to human sacrifice? Was Mesha understanding the Herem in this case to be a sacrifice to his god? So when he killed the Israelite men, boys, and girls, and women, was he committing human sacrifice in his mind? And notice that Tom Stark compares this to Numbers 21. So if you read Numbers 21 from the beginning, verses 2 to 3 specifically, the nation of Israel collectively makes a vow that they will, if Yahweh gives their enemies, King Arad and his armies, to them, in other words, let them be victorious, they will devote their cities to destruction. All right, devote the cities. So the word used is Herem. And what happens is, the text says Yahweh listened to the voice of Israel and handed over the Canaanites, and then they were defeated, and the cities were destroyed. Right? And Tom Stark specifically says that Israel promises Yahweh the sacrificial offering of the city's inhabitants. All right, non-combatants. Rob had cited in his response to me an article by Mike Wegman in the journal Verbum, he basically argued that Rob argued that Wegman doesn't call it human sacrifice, and that's true. He doesn't actually use the words human sacrifice anywhere in the journal. which is fine with me, and it doesn't really matter to me, because what I've noticed is that Christian commentators tend to explain more the reason for Herem, whether it's to remove a contagion, the pagan contagion, rather than explain what it actually entails, what does it imply, right? When you're killing somebody, the reason might be, yeah, you're killing them because they're pagans and they might entice your people, but when you're devoting them to your God, then what is that? That is human sacrifice, nothing else. So I had made the point that Wegman is a liberal scholar. He agrees that most of these events didn't even happen. They're not historical. So the book of Joshua wasn't even written by Joshua. It was written in the 7th or 8th centuries. Same time around the book of Deuteronomy was written. He specifically says that the Battle of Jericho in Joshua 6 is not a historical event. Reason being that the Israelites are thought to have entered the Holy Land around 1400 BCE, and the battle would have occurred around that time, whereas Jericho was destroyed in 1550 BCE, 150 years before. And there's other scholarly discussion on this as well, but this is what Mike Wegman says. Now, he also describes Herem as basically meaning devotion, prescription, or a solemn ban, which is all well and good. All right, I had made the point that Herem warfare was not unique to ancient Israel. This is well known. We already saw the Mesha Stele, and it's also found in the Bible, many places. So again, I would ask our Christian friends, if you're looking at King Mesha performing Herem and dedicating these towns, devoting Nebo, for example, to Chemosh, would that not be human sacrifice? All right, this is again some text from the Jewish Study Bible, calling it specifically an offering to God. They comment how the commentators like Rashi and others tend to ignore the context of all these verses, Leviticus 27, 29. They say that all these different interpretations, ignoring the context that it's not about human sacrifice, have little basis. All right, then so here's an important point. There are two types of vows that we can talk about in the Bible. There's a nader, which is a personal vow, and there's the Herem, which is a communal vow, right? An example of a nader will be Judges 11, where Jephthah makes the vow to sacrifice whatever comes out of his house. That's a nader. That's a vow of dedication, a personal vow. It could be private property, but if you look at the text of Judges 11, it specifically uses the word nader. But a Herem is a communal dedication. And notice the language that Benowitz uses. All right, the communal property set aside for God can be either spoils of war or people and property condemned by the authorities, sometimes metaphorically said to be sacrificed by God himself. And here's another important point, because Rob made this point, that there was no temple, there was no altar, there was a tabernacle, so therefore it was not human sacrifice. Benowitz says that human beings or livestock devoted to God under the circumstances are slaughtered as an offering, albeit without the trappings of an altar and temple. So it's not like what we normally picture as human sacrifice, like in Indiana Jones' Temple of Doom, or the Aztecs. You know, they had a temple where they would kill these prisoners of war as sacrifices. We didn't have that in this case. And that would be pretty impractical anyway, because you can't, if you're going to bring 1,000 people or 500 people to a temple or tabernacle and kill them, it's going to take a long time. It's going to be very messy. So you just killed them in the towns that you captured. You burned the entire city down. All right, Benowitz, also cites Isaiah 34, verses 1 through 8. And I think this is one of the clearest examples of Herem being associated with sacrifice, because Herem is mentioned in Isaiah 34, verse 2. And then in verse 6, God himself says that he's going to make a sacrifice. So notice the language here. Notice the imagery. He has a sword, which is sated with blood, has the fat and blood of lambs and goats and rams. All right, these are sacrificial animals. And then it says, for the Lord has a sacrifice in Basra. The word in Hebrew is zebah, sacrifice. We have Eid al-Adha coming up on Tuesday for most people, where we sacrifice an animal. We call it a zebah, right? It's a sacrifice. So the same word is used in the Hebrew and is associated directly with with Herem. And here's the word Zebah. And notice how it cites Isaiah 34, verse 6. And it's also used in Jeremiah 46:10. Right, the same language. Notice that it says, the sword shall devour and be sated and drink all its fill of their blood. For the Lord God of hosts, holds a sacrifice. Once again, Zebah is used, except in this case, it's now in the north country by the river Euphrates, whereas in Isaiah 34, it's on Edom, but Edom here is representing all the nations, the sinful nations. Right, and I cited the ESV Study Bible where it literally says the world becomes a bloody altar. Right, the altar is used for sacrifices. So again, Herem is used in verse 2, and then verse 6 says there's a sacrifice. So the direct association with sacrifice is made. All right, this is repetition there. So right here again, Isaiah 34:6. I just want to clarify this. For the Lord has a sacrifice. And again, if you read verse 2, it's not shown here, but verse 2 mentions Herem. 1 Samuel 59, everyone knows this, the slaughter of the Amalekites. Why was Saul punished? Well, because he did not devote everything to destruction as he had said he was supposed to do. He kept all the best animals. He killed all the people, but he spared all the best animals. These animals were supposed to be destroyed. That's why he was punished and removed as king. He couldn't part with this wealth, this mass wealth that the Amalekites had. And about 30 seconds to go. I also cited Deuteronomy 13, where it says that if one of the Israelite cities commits idolatry, even if a few people do it and if they're tolerated, then the Israelites are told to destroy that city. And it specifically uses the word for burnt offering or a whole offering. All right, notice how it says devoting to destruction, that's Herem, and then offer it as a whole burnt offering to the Lord your God. And this is from the BDB lexicon where it specifically cites Deuteronomy 13:17 as a sacrificial term. And that's my presentation. Exactly 20 minutes. Let me stop sharing. Luis, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you very much for your presentation. So I did not prepare a PowerPoint. So what I've done instead is I opened up all of the relevant tabs on my Verbum Bible software that I'm going to be citing as part of my presentation. And hopefully you will see me as I put the pieces together in real time. So the question is Herem a human sacrifice? So I'll be arguing in the negative. And I'm going to argue that, more specifically, that in order to claim that the Herem is a human sacrifice, we basically have to play semantic games with the word sacrifice. But if we were to define sacrifice the way that the Bible defines it, we will see that the Bible nowhere envisions the Herem as a sacrifice. So a lot of this will be defining terms because that is a key part of my argument. So we'll begin by defining the main word in question, which is Herem. So Herem comes from the Hebrew root haram, which has to do with devoting things or to banning them. So in the theological word book of the Old Testament, it states this: the root haram is used only in the causative stems 48 times in the Hifil and 3 in the Hofal. The basic meaning is the exclusion of an object from use or abuse of man in its irrevocable surrender to God. The word is related to an Arabic root meaning to prohibit, especially to ordinary use. The word harem, meaning the special quarters for Muslim wives, comes from it. It is also related to an Ethiopic root meaning to forbid, prohibit, lay under a curse. Surrendering something to God meant devoting it to the service of God or putting it under a ban for utter destruction. So a lot of times the ban is used to eliminate things that are a hindrance to the spiritual life of the people of Israel, as the theological word book further says. Usually, haram means a ban for utter destruction, the compulsory dedication of something which impedes or resists God's work, which is considered to be accursed before God. And of course, this word is most famously used in the book of Joshua to refer to the destruction of a number of important cities cities such as Jericho, Ai, Hatzor, etc. We can look, for example, at Joshua chapter 6, verse 17 through 18, where the word is used multiple times in a short span. So in verse 17 it says, "V'haita ha'ir cherem hi v'chol asher ba la'Adonai." Okay, so, and Joshua, basically, it says here that the city and everything in it is put under cherem, to God, or to the Lord. And then in verse 18 it says, "Verach atem shimru min hacherem pen atacharimu velakachtem min hacherem v'samtem et machane Yisrael lecherem va'akartem oto." So this leads us to the question, what exactly is cherem in this context? And if you look at all of the various English translations, they have a number of different ways of translating this. So it could mean, they could sometimes say, you know, devoted to God for destruction, or placed under a ban or accursed, or in the case of the JPS Tanakh, which I have over here, proscribed. I believe that proscribed is the most accurate translation of this word, and I'm going to explain why later. You can see here that the idea behind it is that these things are being removed from human use. And in fact, one of the major points that needs to be made is that this word is often misunderstood because English translations usually do not render it properly. And this is a point that is often made. This is particularly made by John and J. Harvey Walton in their book, The Lost World of the Israelite Conquest. So in part 5 of their book, they basically argue this: what God and the Israelites are doing is often misunderstood because the Hebrew word cherem is commonly mistranslated. And they have a number of propositions related to this. First is that cherem does not mean to utterly destroy. There are times when cherem does involve destruction, but is not a necessary part of putting something under a ban. So after looking at some of the translations, the Waltons argue, quote, "Alternatively, we suggest that the word actually refers to the removal of something from human use. The emphasis is not on the object, but on everyone around the object. No one shall make use of this. When cherem objects are destroyed, the purpose of the destruction is to make sure that nobody can use it. But not all cherem objects are destroyed." Most notably, Joshua 11, verse 12-13 reports that all of the northern cities were cherem, yet Joshua destroys only one of them, Hatzor. Likewise, a field that is cherem is not destroyed, but becomes the property of the priests. Destruction, when it occurs, is a means to an end. So there are many ways of removing something from use, and destruction is one of them, but it is not the only way to do that. And one of the important things that the Waltons make note of is that the vast majority of times, cherem is used on inanimate objects as well as land. It's only in a few relatively rare instances that it is actually applied to human beings. So they state here that it is the rarest category. And one of the places where it occurs, as noted by the Waltons, is Leviticus 27, which our interlocutor has cited already. So let's go there. So Leviticus 27, verses 28 through 21. "Kol cherem asher yacharim ish la'Adonai mikol asher lo me'adam uvehema umisde achuzato lo imaker v'lo igael kol cherem kodesh kadashim hu la'Adonai. But of all that anyone owns, be it man or beast or land of his holding, nothing that he has prescribed for the Lord may be sold or redeemed. Every prescribed thing is totally consecrated to the Lord. No human being has," and then it goes on to say, "Kol cherem asher yacharim min ha'adam lo yipade mot yumat." So in English, no human being who's been prescribed can be ransomed. He shall be put to death. So what does this mean? So the Waltons make a very important note here, and is that this passage does not teach that that a man can just arbitrarily put someone else to the cherem. So let me see if I can find it. So what they argue is that, in fact, the point of the cherem is not of this passage is not that you can just willy-nilly give a herem, put a herem on someone, but that if someone is put under the herem, then they cannot be redeemed. And in fact, it's very important to make note of the ransom language, because that occurs a number of times elsewhere in the Old Testament, particularly in the context of putting people to death for capital crimes. So for example, in Numbers 35, 31 through 32, it says this: "You may not accept a ransom for the life of a murderer who was guilty of a capital crime. He must be put to death. Nor may you accept ransom in lieu of flight to a city of refuge, enabling one to return to live on his land before the death of the priest." This is in contrast with other passages, such as Exodus 21, verse 30, where certain crimes may cause someone to be liable to the death penalty. However, a ransom may be laid upon them in lieu of the death penalty. So if we cross-reference Leviticus with 27, 28 to 29 with these capital crimes, we could see that the herem has to do with the application of the death penalty for certain offenses. Now let's go from here to the question of the question of sacrifice in the Bible. So the question is, what exactly is a sacrifice? And the problem with answering this question is that in modern parlance, we tend to use sacrifice rather loosely. So for example, if I say that if I give money to my church and volunteer for their social programs, I could say that I am sacrificing my time and money to my parish. Or if a soldier dies in battle, we can say that he sacrificed his life for his country. But obviously, when we're talking about sacrifice in the biblical context, we have to narrow it down to what exactly a sacrifice is. So in the Lexham Theological Word Book, it states that the sacrifice, as defined by the Bible, is the act of offering something as a means of atonement, worship, or thanksgiving. The offering may include slaughtering an animal or making an offering of grain or another agricultural product. So in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, we find a number of words that are used to denote sacrifice, and the Lexham Word Book mentions a number of them. You have the noun zevach, which is sacrifice, which comes from the Hebrew root zavach. And of course, it says here, such an offering involved the killing of the sacrificial animal, which would then be placed on the altar, which also comes from the same root, mizbeach. And then you have other words such as olah, which means a whole burnt offering. And you have a shelem, which is a peace offering. And then you have the pesach, which is the Passover sacrifice. And then you have the mincha, which is the gift offering, and then finally the korban, which is offering. Notice which word is conspicuously absent from the Lexham Word Book's list of words denoting sacrifice. Nowhere do they list herem as one of the words that are used to denote a sacrifice. And this is because the purpose of a herem is different from the purpose of a zevach or a shelem or a pesach or a korban. It states here that the purpose of the sacrifice is a way for the people to atone for sin, to give thanks or praise to God for blessings, to complete purification rituals, to dedicate themselves in worship to God. These were all means for the community to maintain relationship with the Lord. None of this has to do with, say, removing something from use or eliminating identity, as the Waltons would put it. And in fact, there are only a few places where the words for sacrifice, as noted here, and the word herem appear together. In all of those places, they are clearly distinguished from each other. And in fact, our interlocutor has already mentioned a couple of them, so we will go to a few of them and see what exactly these passages mean. So first, we have Samuel chapter 15. This is one of the passages that has already been cited. So herem language does come up in verse 3. So you can see here, it's vahachari ramtem, so prescribe. And then if we go down to verses 7 through 8, okay, and I'll just read the English translation. Saul destroyed Amalek from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is close to Egypt, and he captured King Agag of Amalek alive. He proscribed all the people, putting them to the sword. But Saul and the troops spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the second-born, the lambs, and all else that was of value. They would not proscribe them. They proscribed only what was cheap and worthless. So notice something. Saul is not putting the best of the animals under the Herem, and we will shortly see why he does this. So in verse 15, after Samuel answered why he did not put the animals under Herem, Saul answers, "They were brought from the Amalekites, for the troops spared the choices of the sheep and oxen for sacrificing to the Lord your God, and we proscribed the rest." So in this one passage, we have a clear distinction between proscribing and sacrificing. So the reason these animals were not given as a herem is so that they can be given as a zevach instead. So already we're starting to see the argument fall apart, because if a herem is a sacrifice, then what is the point behind this distinction? And that goes on if we go down to verse 21 onwards. I proscribed Amalek, and the troops took from the spoil some sheep and oxen, the best of what had been prescribed, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal. Once again, Saul is trying to make excuses for his actions. But then Samuel says this, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much in obedience to the Lord's command? Surely obedience is better than sacrifice, compliance than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, defiance like the iniquity of teraphim. Because you rejected the Lord's command, he has rejected you as king." This would make no sense if the harem and the zebach were the same, because it's clearly stated that the Lord does not want a zebach. He wants obedience to his command, and his command is to give herem. Also, if those two things were analogous or similar to each other, Saul could simply say, well, I am fulfilling the herem, I'm just doing it by way of a zebach. But of course, because the Bible does not equate these two things, such an excuse would not work, and Saul does not attempt to offer it. Now we can go to Isaiah chapter 34, which is the other passage that was mentioned in the context of this discussion. Now, our interlocutor has stated that the herem and the sacrifice are equated here, but as we shall shortly see, that is not the case. So first, let's look at the one verse that actually mentions the herem. Ki ketzef la'Adonai al kol hagoyim v'chema al kol tzva'a Herimam Natanam Lebtavach. Okay, so in the English translation, for the Lord is angry at all the nations, furious at all their hosts. He has proscribed or doomed them, consigned them to slaughter. So who is the object of the herem in this case? It is the nations and all of their host. Okay, so make note of that. You have the verb, which is the haram verb, and then the object of that verb is the nations. Now let's go to verse 6, which is the passage that has sacrifice mentioned in it. Cherev la'Adonai mal Adam hudashna mechelev midam karim va'atudim mechelev kiliot elim ki zevach la'Adonai bevatzra v'tevach gadol be'eretz Edom. The Lord has a sword. It is sated with blood. It is gorged with fat, the blood of lambs and he-goats, the kidney fat of rams. For the Lord holds a sacrifice in Botzra, a great slaughter in the land of Edom. Okay, so now we have sacrifice here. Now, here's the question. What is the object of the sacrifice? If we look at the verse, it's clear what is being sacrificed here. You have lambs, he-goats, rams, and then you have in verse 7 continues, wild oxen shall fall with them, young bulls with mighty steers, and their land shall be drunk with blood, and their soil shall be saturated with fat. So if you look closely, even though herem and zevach occur in the same passage, they're not being used with the same objects. Herem is what the God does to the nations, but zevach is what God does to the animals. So rather than these two terms being equated, the two actions are being done to two different objects, all right? So it's clear here that Zebach and Herem are being treated as two distinct actions. So I have 3 minutes left, and I'm going to use this time to talk about Judges 11 because Jephthah's vow was brought up, okay? So first of all, I want to make note that Herem language is not used in Judges 11:29. So strictly speaking, if the question is, does Herem denote human sacrifice, this passage isn't actually relevant because there's no Herem involved here. But since it's been brought up, I think it's worth mentioning altogether. So it has already been mentioned that there's a couple of different ways this passage has been understood. There are some interpreters who say that perhaps Jephthah did not actually sacrifice his daughter, but instead consigned her to perpetual virginity. And some notable scholars, such as Khalil and Delich, have made this argument, and I think that there is enough ambiguity in the text that you can make a plausible argument for it. However, let's assume the worst and say that Jephthah did indeed sacrifice his daughter. Now, let's make a note of a few things, all right? First of all, just because Jephthah is said to be have the Spirit of the Lord doesn't mean that he is free from all sin, right? So this is a misunderstanding of the biblical view of the Spirit. The Spirit does not guarantee that the person will be protected from all error. It is still possible while under the Spirit of the Lord to commit sins, all right? Let's get that out of the way. Second, if we understand Judges in light of Deuteronomistic history, as most historical critics would have it, then we should really understand Judges in light of the book of Deuteronomy. And as is already known, Deuteronomy already has a prohibition against human sacrifice. So if we read Judges in light of Deuteronomy, we are actually already meant to understand that this is not correct. Finally, it's worth noting that in the law, there is actually provision for rash vows. So in Leviticus 5, verses 4 through 6, there is a law stating that if someone makes a vow thoughtlessly and then realizes that he has made the vow thoughtlessly, he can, in lieu of fulfilling his vow, make an guilt offering to the Lord. Perhaps if Jephthah had been aware of that, he would have done that, but we have no indication that Jephthah is actually aware of all the provisions of the law because he's not only willing to fulfill his rash vow, but also commits sacrifice. I have a lot more points to say, but I'm out of time, so hopefully we'll do that in the following discussion.
All right,
Okay.
thank you, Luis. All right, so we agreed that we would have 20 minutes each, and then after that it will be free form. So, sorry, Steve, Brother Khalil, Brother Faz, you're now also welcome to offer your views, and obviously Luis and myself as well. For the people who are watching, we can open it up to your participation towards the end. For now, we're gonna leave it to our esteemed members.
Maybe I could ask a few questions then.
Okay, who's talking first of all?
It's me, Luis.
Okay, oh, sorry, yeah, all right, go ahead.
Okay, so you use quite a bit of historical criticism in your presentations. All right, so just for clarification, I'm actually skeptical of the documentary hypothesis and a lot of these other historical critical theories, but I've learned as someone who is constantly exposed to it to argue under their premises for the sake of argument. So let's say for the sake of argument that all of this is late, okay? You're familiar with the concept of Deuteronomistic history, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so you know that under the idea of the Deuteronomistic history, the book of Deuteronomy is meant to be the lens by which we read the historical books. So Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. You're familiar with this concept, correct?
Yes.
So if this is the case, and we know that in the book of Deuteronomy, there is a prohibition for human sacrifice, wouldn't it be weird that the exact same historical books that we're meant to read in light of the book of Deuteronomy contain references to human sacrifice, according to your view?
Sorry, could you repeat your question?
Wouldn't it be odd that the historical books as part of the Deuteronomistic history are meant to be read in light of Deuteronomy, but they would be advocating for human sacrifice, as you put it?
I don't see how that would be strange. I mean, the books of the Bible have undergone several rounds of editing. So you're talking about maybe like a uniform history, which I don't think is the case here. So I don't see why that's strange.
Okay, so is it your view then that this that the Herem commands precede the book of Deuteronomy?
I don't think we can say anything regarding the transmission with certainty. I mean,
Okay.
there are certain parts that were written that could have been written earlier. We don't know for sure. But for example, the source that Rob has cited, Mike Wegman, he says very blankly that these were later texts written I believe he said the 7th century, 8th century, not in the time of Moses or Joshua.
Well, if I understand standard historical critical theories correctly, all of these books were supposedly written around the same time as each other, which would be around the 6th century. If that's the case, then this argument would fall apart because
but written by whom? You don't even know who the authors are.
Well, I'm just going by the standard theories as propounded by most proponents of the theory of Deuteronomistic history.
Mm-hmm. But again, you don't know if it was one author or two authors, were they the same? Who were they?
But see, here's the thing. You're the one arguing the affirmative, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And in order for the affirmative argument to stand, you have to, one of the planks in your argument is that the prohibition for human sacrifice is later than Herem, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so you have to then...
At least that understanding is later, yes.
So you then have to justify that particular plank, that the prohibition of human sacrifice comes after the Herem.
Sorry, say that again?
You have to justify that plank in your argument that the prohibition of human sacrifice as found in the book of Deuteronomy is actually post-dates the Herem passages in Joshua and Judges.
Okay, I'm sure I can look into that. I wasn't thinking we're going to go into a discussion about that specifically.
Yeah.
That could be a topic for a future discussion, certainly.
All right, fair enough.
Can I interject, or I mean, after Luiz?
Certainly, yes. Brother, go ahead.
All right. Well, first of all, I just want to say, good job to the both of you, Faz and Luiz, for having a nice presentation and bringing up scholarly work, and clearly you guys did your homework, so props to you guys. For me, I mean, I guess to add a little bit of substance into the situation and put it back into perspective, we're still talking here about the idea of sacrifice, correct?
Yes.
And Jesus is in question here. This is why this is happening. And not deviating from the topic or anything, but it is important that we put it, like I said, into perspective. Who are we talking about here? Does everyone here from our Christian friends accept the hypostatic union, that Jesus is 100% man, 100% God?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, cool. So when Jesus was crucified and died, who died? Which nature died? Did God die, or did the flesh die?
Excuse me, how is this relevant to the topic of discussion?
I literally gave you like a small intro telling you that we are talking about sacrifice, and that is back to, when I put it back into perspective, who are we talking about?
Okay, but
So,
you're trying to make this a debate about the hypostatic union.
No, I did not, my friend. I asked you whether you believe, to make a point after that you didn't let me finish. Question was not about, I asked you whether you believe in it, because I'm building up upon that. That's okay. If that's something that will make you nervous, we can move on to something else. But the core...
I'm not nervous about anything. I'm just trying to see how this is relevant to the...
Because it has to do with sacrifice.
Well, and so then the topic is in regards to Herem and sacrifice. So let's keep it to that. We could talk about the hypostatic union.
So are we gonna just talk about one topic and not put it back to perspective to what it is related to? I mean, that's the whole point. It's
Let
a
me
conversation.
let me just clarify. I don't care if you want to say that Herem is not a human sacrifice. That's fine. Brother Khalil is making the point, I think, if I'm understanding him correctly,
Right.
that there's still some sacrificial aspect here, right? But the point is, does the Bible have this concept that sacrifice is accepted by God?
Right. Can I just add, if I could just add something there to what Brother Khalil just said. Luiz mentioned Deuteronomy chapter 12:31 and Deuteronomy 18:10 in regards to God did not require sacrifice. Am I right in stating that, Luiz? Luiz.
Sorry,
Luiz,
I didn't cite those specific passages, but I'm just talking about the general prohibition.
Yeah, that's fine. But I just gave you two verses just to clear or give you evidence from the Old Testament, from Deuteronomy, in regards to human sacrifice, basically, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So the thing is, if what you rightfully said in regards to the prohibition of human sacrifice in the Old Testament, but we find that Jesus was a human sacrifice. So therefore God has gone against his own revelation of that he does not desire human sacrifice.
See,
Well,
this
Faz,
is where
where you,
Sorry?
Faz, how are you defining human sacrifice? Because human sacrifice
human
was the point I was
sacrifice
making.
is the human sacrifice is the flesh of Christ, because God did not die.
That was the point I was making, exactly.
Yeah. God, because it's God, the spirit, the divine nature doesn't die, because in 1 Timothy 6:16, he tells us, for I am alone, I'm immortal, and and I live, and no one can reach me, and no one can see me. Yeah. So he's telling us, if he's telling us that the divine nature is not dead, and then it's the human flesh that died, then that goes against Deuteronomy 12:31 and Deuteronomy 18:10. So this is why I wanted to add on to what Luiz was saying in regards to if Herem is not referring to human sacrifice, then that goes against you then, because Deuteronomy 12:31 is telling us God detests human sacrifice. Yet when you come to the crucifixion of Jesus, you like to separate the human flesh and the divine. So it was the human that died, so that's a human sacrifice. That's my point.
So let me
Thank you.
clarify a few. Amir wanted to say something.
Yeah, I just want to know what Deuteronomy is referring as human sacrifice and sacrifice of Christ. And just to clarify, I don't hold the penal substitution theory of atonement. I hold the Christus Victor, so I don't hold that position. But just to note, what you stated does not really follow, because Deuteronomy is talking about human sacrifice in a very specific way. The sacrifice of Christ on the cross does not fit within that Roman category. So that premise.
So could you then explain to me in what sense this is the human sacrifice referring to in Deuteronomy 12:31 and Deuteronomy 18:10?
Yeah, taking a human and offering them on the altar to a deity, particularly within a priestly cultic context.
Right. So when Christians tell us that the sacrifice of Christ is foreshadowing the Old Testament sacrifice system, so what's the difference between that? Because in the old sacrifice system in the Old Testament, they have to be put on an altar.
There are a lot of things in the Old Testament that foreshadow the work of Christ.
But the sacrifice of Christ is for Christians tell us. Just 1 minute. Christians tell us that the sacrificial system in the Old Testament is foreshadowing Christ. Did Christ fulfill the sacrificial system, the criteria in the Old Testament? Was he put on an altar? Was he sacrificed by a Levite priest? Was the blood put on the four corners of the altar? Was it?
No.
Thank you very much.
Because that's not the point of fulfilling it. So it is.
It's a foreshadow.
So
Jesus, the animal that was sacrificed in the Old Testament, did he come back to life again? No, he died. He's dead. Khalas. Jesus, according to you, came back to life 3 days later. That's not a sacrifice.
Okay.
Jesus died on the cross. So
the point is that the Old Testament sacrifice are not meant to be a one-to-one correlation with Christ's sacrifice. That's not how a typology works. A typology is certain specific elements of the picture are meant to foreshadow the antitype, but not every single element of the picture is meant to foreshadow the antitype.
So what was he foreshadowing then?
The element that is being foreshadowed is atonement. So you know how in Leviticus chapter 16 you have the Yom Kippur sacrifice, and it says that the blood is offered in order to cover for sin. So
The blood of who? Of what?
in the context of Yom Kippur, it's the
Yes.
blood of the animals that are being sacrificed.
Right. That's what we're talking about. So it's foreshadowing that.
So can we bring this back to the Herem then?
It
So,
is for part of it. It is part of the Herem because
Okay.
because Louis said, whoever said that the Old Testament is telling us that God does not desire human sacrifice. My brother Q put on a case that Herem was in reference to human sacrifices to God. You said that's not the case, so then that's why then we asked. Then you said if Herem means human sacrifice to God, that goes against what's mentioned in Deuteronomy. So then I brought up Deuteronomy, and then I said if that's the case, then that cannot be. Then if God does not require human sacrifice, then that cannot be referring. Then why is Jesus on the cross when he dies? Christians automatically say it's the human side, not the divine side.
Let's bring it back to the thesis of the topic. The thesis is
Okay, so okay, let's do that. I think Brother Faz and Brother Khalil made a very valid point, but you guys are not answering. But let's bring it back to Herem if you want.
Oh, I was answering the point. The fact that you don't want to accept it doesn't mean it's not valid.
Okay, so
let me make
your point one more time for us and for everybody that's watching or listening. Go ahead. If you don't mind. Apologies for making you repeat it again. Go ahead.
Typology is not meant to be a one-to-one correlation. So certain elements of the Old Testament sacrifices are foreshadowing of the antitype, but not every single element of the Old Testament types are meant to be part of that foreshadowing.
Could you give us an example then? Can you give us an example, please, if you don't mind?
I just mentioned, oh my goodness.
Yes, you said
Yom Kippur, Leviticus 16. The
Yom Kippur.
Yeah.
Guys, can we please get back to the topic? This is going off a red herring trail.
All right. So
this is not a red herring, by the way.
It's not a red herring, but let's get back to Herem. All right. Let me respond. Let me ask a question. I asked this question before too. So you guys made the point that human sacrifice, as you understand it, must involve an altar, right, or like a cultic act. Is that correct?
If we're going to define sacrifice the way the Hebrew Bible defines sacrifice, then yes.
Okay, so would you say that when Mesha, in the Mesha Stele, he said he devoted the cities to destruction, and he devoted the people there, the men and women, to Chemosh, that would not be sacrifice according to the biblical definition?
It's funny you should mention that, because I was looking up some information on the Mesha Stele just before we had this discussion. And I don't know if you're familiar with the book, The Biblical Herem by Philip Stern, but he has a whole chapter called The Implications of the Mesha Inscription. And I've been skimming through that, and I cannot find any place there where he describes the Mesha inscription as the Herem as found in the Mesha inscription as a sacrifice. So I would say that according to most interpreters of that, it is not a sacrifice.
So when he says that he devoted the men and women, the damsels, he says, I devoted it to Ashtar Chemosh, he's not saying it's a sacrifice.
He's not saying it's a sacrifice.
Okay, so you wouldn't consider it a sacrifice?
I wouldn't consider it a sacrifice, and I don't think anyone who has read it considers it a sacrifice.
Okay.
No. Well, and just to piggyback off of what Lewis noted, the particular Herem that was being practiced, particularly with the Joshua conquest, that was more of a purgation of the land of the impurity of the idolatry, because back in the ancient Near East, there was no distinction between holy or secular, like we understand it in modern day thinking. And the land was basically Yahweh's, and it was to be purged, or the inhabitants were to be devoted or dedicated for destruction. that commentary mentioned by Peter and what's his name? I was looking a little bit through it. One of the translations they noted would fit a little more better would be cursed to destruction. And Lewis mentioned this earlier. In the Septuagint translation, one of the ways it was rendered was anathema and anathematizo. I forget the last part, but basically it's in reference to be accursed or banned. Cursed to destruction would be a more fitting translation or rendering of Herem in that particular instance. Basically, it was a restoration of order out of chaos in ancient Israelite thinking. It was not in the sense of, oh, hey, here's some people here, let's devote the outlay for sacrifice. No, it was in reference.
So can I ask, how do we bring it back to order, or from chaos, by killing children? What do the children have to do with this?
Well, this goes back to ancient Near Eastern hyperbole.
So you believe that children were not actually killed?
I personally, I don't believe they were. Matter of fact, even Judges notes that they weren't. They didn't kill off all the Canaanites. At best, that
doesn't answer the question. I didn't say if they didn't kill off all of them. I said, were children killed? So were some children killed? Was even one child killed?
I would say no.
So not at all. So whenever the Bible says kill them all, the women and children, it's all hyperbole.
Pretty much.
And on what basis do you make this claim?
Well, there's actually a large body of literature dedicated to studying the concept of hyperbole in ancient Near Eastern texts. So I would refer to you people like Kenneth Kitchen, Richard Hess, Paul Copan. They've all. So,
Luis, you would agree with Steve that no children would have been actually killed?
See, I'm not too sure about that. So it is actually possible that the cities that are mentioned in Joshua were purely military installations. So the only people inhabiting them were military personnel, political officials, etc. So there's nothing inherently implausible about that possibility.
So by military, do you mean only soldiers, not their wives, not their children, right?
Well,
wasn't Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 11? God was disappointed in him because he left some animals alive. In 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse number 2 to 3, when God told him to go and tell them to smite the Amalekites, he killed everyone, didn't he? And God was upset because he left a few animals, so he didn't kill them. So obviously that means that he actually killed children.
No, that's funny, because if you read all of the historical books, hyperbolic usage is also at work in 1 Samuel, because the Amalekites actually show up again later on in, for example, the end in 2 Samuel chapter 1. An Amalekite shows up and he claims to have killed Saul. So we know that there were still some of them there.
But the point is, there may have been a few Amalekites still remaining, but the point is, did he kill the children? That's what Brother Q is asking you.
Yes.
Yeah, the order was specific to go back and kill the children and don't let anything breathe and finish everything.
And that is why God regretted making Saul a king, because he left some of the animals still alive in 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 11. So therefore then, that shows to me that he killed majority of the kids, of the children. So
tying this back to the topic of discussion, let's say worst case scenario, kids were killed. Does it follow from that the killing of the kids was a form of human sacrifice, as is stated in the thesis?
Yes.
Sorry, man. With all due respect, you keep saying, let's get back to the topic of discussion, like we're talking about IHOP and pancakes. This is what it is. Sacrifice, harem, animals, babies. This is what we're talking about, bro. This is the topic. I mean, you can't just restrict it to the word.
Let me bring it back.
Let's say kids were killed,
Even in Numbers chapter 31, verse number 17 to 18, when God gave instructions to Moses to kill every woman who's not slept with a man, and just keep the children who have not slept, keep them for yourselves. So he killed people.
Okay, since the topic is whether Herem is a sacrifice, let's say worst case scenario, there were in fact women and children killed.
Not worst case scenario, it
Okay,
did happen.
let me finish the train of thought, okay? Does it follow from that the original thesis that the Herem is a human sacrifice is established thereby?
Yes, I think it is. Let me show why. All right. I don't think you talked about Deuteronomy 13 in your presentation. I mentioned it in my presentation. So in Deuteronomy 13, starting from verse 12, it specifically says, if you hear in one of your cities, these are the Israelite cities, which the Lord your God is giving you to dwell there, if anyone there, worships a false god, you are to, first of all, make a, let me share my screen just to, so everyone can see. All right, you guys can see Deuteronomy 13?
I do want to say something, if you don't mind, Mr. Q and all the
Go
brothers
ahead,
here.
brother. Go ahead, bro.
Yeah, it's been running over an hour and a half, I think, and just because I didn't think we were gonna stay that long, and I do have to take care of something. Do you guys mind if I either leave or if you guys want to pause it here and we carry on, all of us, another time? Just a suggestion, whatever you guys are comfortable with.
Is that you want to?
I would like to continue. Bro,
Yeah,
It's
because
just a brother Q. I've got to start my fast in about 20 minutes, bro. So,
yeah, no,
yeah,
bro, no problem, bro, no problem.
yeah,
is that okay?
Q and Lewis, I'm sorry, bro. I gotta get going soon too, cause I gotta get some things done. I gotta help my dad get the dog upstairs, cause it's bedtime.
Yeah, no problem, guys.
What do you guys want to do? Can we do?
I mean,
What do you guys wanna
we could pick this up like another time.
Let me just make a quick point. Actually, 2 quick points.
I want to let him make his point, okay? And also, I want to cover Isaiah 34. So if you can do at least those 2 things.
Yes, I want to talk about Isaiah 34. Yes. After Deuteronomy 13. Brother Khalil and Faz, if you want to go, that's fine. No worries. All right. So the point I wanted to make was.
I'll stick with you.
Jazakallah khair. Jazakallah khair.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so what the point I was making was in Deuteronomy 13, this law that is made here, if you have a town or city, these are Israelite towns, and if somebody in that town says, let us go work and serve other gods, there's supposed to be an investigation, and if they're found that it is true, and the city has been tolerating this, it doesn't even matter that the entire city is not taking part in this. As long as that person is there and has not been killed, the whole city has to be destroyed. So now, my question would be, is this a military installation, or are there children also among these people? So when the city is destroyed, are all the people in the city destroyed? And it also says devoted to destruction, so it's Herem. And then it says, it uses the word for burnt offering, whole offering, which the BDB lexicon says literally is a sacrificial term.
Okay, so first, I would need to find some instances of how this passage has been applied in the actual historical books, because I know that there were times when certain cities were destroyed, but also God also made provisions for people who were righteous in them to be spared. We can get that some other time, but let's look at the passage, the use of burnt offering here. So if you look closely, what is being burnt as an offering exactly? According to verse 17, what is being burnt as an olah, which is the Hebrew word, isn't the people, it's the spoils. So if you read verse 17 in its entirety, it says, gather all its spoil into the open square and burn the town and all its spoil as a olah to the Lord your God. So what is being offered as an olah is not people, it's the spoils, it's the shlala as it's mentioned in the Hebrew text. So the people may have been eliminated via Herem, but they were not being sacrificed via an olah.
It says you shall gather all its spoils into the midst of the open square. It doesn't say only treasures or something like that. It includes animals, I would assume.
It may have, but the point behind the shlala is that it excludes human beings because they're already killed in the verse preceding that.
Well, the BDB lexicon disagrees with you. It says, and thou shalt burn the city and all its spoil as a whole offering. So the city is also the whole offering. It's part of the whole offering.
No, the BDB, you have to be careful how you use these sources. It's also, it's only giving you a translation of the passage, but it says, "Ve'et kol shlala Khalil Adonai Elohecha haitatel ola lo tibane od." So it says here, the shlala is being burnt as an ola. Can you look up, since you have access to the BDB, can you look up what a shlala means?
I'd have to open. It would take a while for me to actually find it.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
we were trying to wrap it up. You guys were trying to wrap it up, bring up those
All right.
points.
Right. So we should try to cover Isaiah 34 before we wrap up. So
Sure.
can we go to Isaiah 34?
Yeah, yes, we can. Let me bring it over here. So you had made the point that the sacrifice was of the animals, right? What was
Yes.
that?
So if you read the passage carefully, the Herem appears in verse 2. All right. So if you scroll up, it says that the nations in question are being put under Herem by God directly.
Correct.
And then that discussion goes all the way back to verse 5. If you read closely in the passage, there's a subtle shift that occurs right around verse 6, because once it says the Lord has a sword, suddenly he's no longer talking about people, he's talking about animals. So the verses 6 and 7 talks about lambs, he-goats, rams, wild oxen, bulls, etc. So the implication there is what is being sacrificed are these animals.
Okay, so here's the point I wanted to make. And Susan Nidich talks about this in her book, War in the Hebrew Bible. She says that the wild oxen and the mighty bulls are a metaphor for princely nobles, and she cites Ezekiel 39 as proof of this. So let's look at Ezekiel 18. You shall eat the flesh of the mighty and drink the blood of the princes of the earth. The princes of the earth are what? They're called rams, lambs, and he-goats, and bulls. All of them fat beasts of Bashan.
It's funny, it's not entirely clear in the Ezekiel passage that is what it means, but even if that is what it means in the Ezekiel passage, it doesn't logically follow that in Isaiah 34, that is what it means there. So like at most you have established a bare possibility, but it's nowhere clear that that is what the passage means, because I think if you were to interpret the text at face value, it sounds like it's just saying it's like
no, actually, I would argue that Isaiah 34 says very clearly. Verse 6 says the sword is sated with the blood of lambs and goats. So this is referring to sacrificial animals. So if it's already sated, with the blood of these sacrificial animals, then why does it need more animals? Why does it need more wild oxen, more bulls, more, it specifically only says wild oxen and mighty bulls. It does not say, lambs and goats. It just says wild oxen shall fall with them and young steers with the mighty bulls. So I think you can make the point that because the sword has already been sated with the blood of sacrificial animals, in verse 7, when it says wild oxen and mighty bulls, it is referring to humans that are now the victims, because it says the Lord has a sacrifice in Basra, a great slaughter in the land of Edom. And then it says, verse 7, wild oxen shall fall.
Well, that doesn't sound like it follows at all. Just because it says that lambs and he-goats have already been killed, therefore what follows after cannot be also animals. That seems like a non sequitur to me.
It follows perfectly, because again, it is saying it is sated with blood of what? It's gorged with fat of what? Blood of lambs and goats and the fat of kidneys of rams. And then it says, the Lord has a sacrifice in Basra, the capital of Edom, a great slaughter in the land of Edom. What's the great slaughter? The very next verse it says, wild oxen shall fall and young steers with the mighty bulls. So you're telling me that the only slaughter that was going to happen was the animals? I don't think so.
Okay, so you're saying then that the princes are being sacrificed in verse 7.
Yes, because that's what it says in verse 6.
All right. So you're saying that the wild oxen, the mighty bulls, they're a metaphor for the princes. Okay. So here's my next question: is the sacrifice language in verse 6 literal?
Q, I don't mean to interrupt, but just to know, read with that verse right there quoting, that's literally a parallelism. It's when you're referring one or two or three sayings in some, but they're all in reference to the same thing. So
Sorry, so the reference to what?
what's using right here between 5 and 6 all the way to 7, that's parallelism.
Okay, of?
Well, it's in reference, a parallelism is, it's common in ancient Near Eastern literature, it's in Ugaritic literature, it's also used in the Hebrew Bible. Basically, walks and fashion. Basically, it's Yahweh's taken out his vengeance. It's listed right there in verse 8.
Yes. Okay, I still don't see your point though.
I think I see his point. I think he's saying that the lambs, goats, and rams, and the oxen, and the steer, and the mighty bulls are all parallelism that just generally mean animals. Am I understanding you correctly, Steve?
Yeah.
Okay.
And also, just a quick note, I looked up Deuteronomy 13 and the Selala, that's in reference to war booty, goods, and possessions taken from the city that were offered.
But that would also include people, I would assume.
Actually, it doesn't.
It doesn't.
I literally looked up. I literally looked up a halot. Oh, sorry, I said halot. Halot. The Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament. It's more updated and with current information than BDB is.
Oh yeah, that's the thing I need to caution you about the BDB. While it is still considered a highly authoritative source, it is published back in the early 1900s. So at certain points, it's starting to show its age already. But generally speaking, I still think it's reliable, so you can cite it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Also,
right.
so can I make my made a question before Amir hopped in. So is your view then that the sacrifice language in verse 6 is meant to be taken literally?
Well, yes, because there are sacrifices of animals.
Okay, so here's the way I see it. We can say that literal animals were literally being sacrificed, or we can say that non-literal animals were non-literally sacrificed. But it seems like an inconsistency to say that non-literal animals were literally being sacrificed. Because if one part is literal, then the other is as well. But if one part is not literal, then the other part isn't either. You see where I'm going with this?
I don't think, on what basis would you argue that if one verse is literal, the other one has to be literal as well?
Okay, well let's put it this way. Okay, let's say that literal.
Well, let me make a point here. Look at Ezekiel 39. It's talking about a literal war, right? The war of Gog and Magog.
Oh, yeah.
Right. The birds are literally feasting on some flesh. What is the flesh of? The blood of the princes of the earth. They're specifically called rams and lambs and he-goats and bulls. So here's an example of a literal language plus non-literal language.
Oh, friend, we need to be very careful when dealing with eschatological passage because it's highly contentious issue how much of it is to be taken literally. But if I may make my point, if we say that if literal sacrifice is taking place, then it would also follow that what is literally being sacrificed are literal lambs, goats, rams, etc. On the other hand, if all of these animals are just metaphors to refer to princely rulers, etc., then if that part is metaphorical, then the use of sacrifice language in verse 6 is also metaphorical. As in, they're not actually being sacrificed. I mean, they're being killed, but it's not like in a cultic sense because,
but it specifically says the Lord has a sacrifice in Basra.
And it also specifically also says lambs, goats, and rams. So that just brings us back.
That comes before, sir. It says, for the Lord has a sacrifice in Basra, a great slaughter in the land of Edom. Then it says in verse 7, wild oxen, young steers, mighty bulls will fall.
Yeah, but you're assuming that the lambs and the goats, etc., were not part of the sacrifice that are mentioned in the second half of the verse.
It says in verse 6, the Lord has a sword, it is sated with blood. Sated with blood already. It already has the blood of lambs and goats in the fat of the kidneys of rams.
No, but that doesn't follow because
It does follow. That's what it's saying.
Nothing about the passage says that what comes before the mention of the sacrifice isn't part of the sacrifice. That doesn't that's just not how Hebrew works. Like Amir, you know Hebrew parallelism well enough. You can corroborate this, right?
Yeah, basically a parallelism. It's taken two or three sayings or verse, but it's in reference to one thing, and that's basically what it's talking about. Yahweh taking his vengeance on Edom. It states it right there in the next to 8 and 9. For Yahweh has a day of vengeance, a year of recompense for the cause of Zion, and the streams of Edom shall be turned into pitch, and her soil and the sulfur, her land shall become burning pitch. So yeah.
So what you're saying is the wild oxen are literally wild oxen that are being killed. They're the sacrifice?
Well, a thing you have to remember, this is an agrarian society, so a lot of your money is going to be made off of pretty much livestock and crops, etc. So this is also noting that Edom will be economically as well as militarily left in ruin.
Okay, so you're saying that these wild oxen are literally wild oxen that are being sacrificed?
It's perfectly sensible given the ancient Near Eastern context of the passage.
It's also perfectly sensible given the Near Eastern context that where there were literally human sacrifices, that it's also talking about humans here. As I already showed you example from Ezekiel 39, the same metaphor is used for the princes of the earth. These are people that are killed in the war.
Again, to reiterate, if you want to make the argument that the wild oxen, the young steers, and the mighty bulls are metaphorical, in verse 7, you also have to concede that under the same hermeneutic, I can also argue that the sacrifice in the second half of verse 6 is metaphorical.
You're basing that on absolutely nothing, just saying that one verse has to be, if it's literal, then the other one has to be literal too. And I just told you, Ezekiel 39, whether it's apocalyptic or not, whatever it is, eschatological, it's literally saying these people are killed, it's a literal war, and the birds are literally feasting on their flesh. But then uses the metaphor of rams and lambs and he-goats and bulls.
See, here's the thing. Let me explain why I say what I say. Because the word in Isaiah 34:6b is zevach, okay? And whenever zevach occurs, it's a cultic term. So it is the customary word that is used for an animal that is sacrificed on an altar. So if it is literally a zevach, that means literal animals are being literally placed in an altar and being ritually slaughtered, okay? But if zevach is being used here metaphorically, then it's not a cultic sacrifice. But if it's not a cult, and you can argue that it's not a literal zevach in the sense that there's no altar involved, and that would go well with your assertion that verse 7 is also metaphorical, but then that ceases to be a sacrifice in the proper biblical sense.
Not at all, because again, just because elsewhere it's used for animals, here it's saying the sacrifice is in Basra, is in Edom. Edom is the sacrifice. So the meaning, whether it's zevach means something else, only sacrificial animals in other verses, does not mean that it has to mean that here as well.
I have to correct you on one thing. It doesn't say Edom is the sacrifice. It says the sacrifice is in Edom.
Yes, in Basra, in the capital.
Yes. So again, there's nothing in the text that would indicate that people are being offered up as a zebach.
And just a note also, words have usage, not inherent meaning. When zabak is used, it can be used in numerous instances. And to go back to halot, in particular, this issue of Isaiah 34:6, God affects the slaughter of his adversaries. And same language in Ezekiel 39 and Zephaniah 1:7, Hosea 4:9 uses مِمِزْبَحَوْتًا.
Let me also bring up another verse. Go ahead, Steve. You can keep talking.
No, I'm done.
Yeah.
I also have to leave, but it was good talking to y'all.
Yeah, I have a bunch of other stuff to do. I'm gonna let you finish, but I'm just gonna make one last point. The reason why an altar is necessary for a zebach is because an altar comes actually in Hebrew. It comes from the same literal root. In Hebrew, it's a mizbeach. So you can see that zayin bet het root is there as well. So a mizbeach is literally the place where a zebach is.
Yeah, that's like madbah in Arabic, or mazbah, place where you sacrifice. Correct. Similar to the verb.
So let me just make this final point. Isaiah 34, we talk about the sword. The same language and symbolism is used in Jeremiah 46:10. That day is the day of the Lord God of hosts, a day of vengeance, to avenge himself on his foes. The sword shall devour and be sated, and drink its fill of their blood. For the Lord God of hosts holds a sacrifice in the north country by the river Euphrates. And the same word is used, zebach. So notice that it mentions no animals here, right? It just mentions where the sacrifice is going to be, north country by the river Euphrates. And it's the day of vengeance. So vengeance on whom? On God's foes. So obviously there cannot be, literal goats and lambs. They're not God's foes. He's talking about the sinful nations, the Gentile nations, the pagans that are being killed. And he specifically says he's going to hold a sacrifice. So that's my final point. Here, there's nothing here about sacrificial animals.
Is this Jeremiah 46:10?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the exact same usage I referenced earlier. God affecting the destruction of his enemies.
Okay, but again, it's God himself says that this is a sacrifice. That's my point.
Yeah, but literally sacrifice. But what's the usage? Is it literally sacrificing? Is it going to sacrifice somebody, or is this just a usage and effect of I'm going to destroy my enemies? Because again, this is where words have usage, not inherent meaning.
So here you would say when it says zebach, it does not mean a literal sacrifice?
No, it's God causing the effect of downfall of his enemies, destruction of his enemies. Again, words have usage, not inherent meaning.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I definitely disagree.
I'm just like, what criteria do you use?
Exactly. I mean, what are you?
Like, what's your objective academic tool that you use?
I've just come back. It's just so. I've been listening to it because obviously I have to break my fast and everything. But it's just so inconsistent how they like to just keep moving the goalpost. Where in this verse it means this, and this means when it's the same word. No, it doesn't mean this. You need to be consistent, man. You really need to be consistent.
Exactly.
No, you're not.
I was just going with the lexical use of these words, and I explained.
You're saying when it says go and kill the children, that doesn't mean kill the children. You mean go and kill the animals, or that doesn't mean it kills the animals. Come on, bro.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. There's certainly a lot of inconsistency.
I tried my best not to interrupt, to be honest with you, but I'm just watching the methodology used here. And although due respect, I mean, honestly, I'm just trying to figure out what is your objective tool? What academic standard are you using to distinguish between this event means this and this means this? Like when it says go kill children, how is that not go kill children? What would that mean? And how and what do you use to define it the way you define it? This is all we're trying to figure out here, the methodology. But yeah, I think overall it's been great talk. It was definitely nice talking to you guys. We can definitely pick it up next time if you guys want to, unless somebody else wants to add something. And can I just ask something if you guys don't mind?
Yes, brother, go ahead.
Okay, whether the brothers will be interested in actually talking about some theological discussion about the divinity of Christ, the Trinity, anything that has to do with Christianity, things that are the meat and potato of this issue. I mean, I do appreciate this. It was definitely a good thing, and I've learned a lot. But if you guys would be interested, we're definitely down. What do you guys think?
Yeah, Luis and Steve, you guys open to a future discussion on the divinity of Jesus?
Like me coming on here was a last minute snap decision. I normally don't do this kind of thing. So I wouldn't say no, but
It doesn't even have to be like very quickly. We can schedule this, with a week from now or 2 weeks from now, whenever you're available.
Might be a little longer than that. I got a lot of stuff on my plate.
All right, so we'll keep in touch then. Steve, what about you?
Same as Louis.
Louis, we're only asking 1 hour or 1.5 hours of your time, my brother.
I am a PhD student. I'm working on my dissertation, and I'm also working an office job on top of that. So time is not something that I have a whole lot of.
Right, then if you can't do it, try and send some representatives of yours that we can discuss this, the concept of divinity and Trinity and all these sort of things.
Right, and I'll see if somebody wants to go in my place. And honestly, like, I don't know, go tell your people that I'm running scared from you. I don't care.
وقل جاء الحق وزهق الباطل إن الباطل كان زهوقا